Revelation, lesson 9 of 26, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. The first four seals are opened, by Ellis. Here we have it shown on the chart. Rome victorious, 96 to 180 AD. Civil War, AD 185 to 284. Taxation and depression, famine and so forth, AD 200 to 250. And decay and death, AD 250 to 300. 300. Lesson text. Revelation 6, 1 and 2. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. I'd like us to notice a few things here. One of the four living creatures said, as with a voice of thunder, which represents the voice of authority, "Come," evidently ordering the first horse, the white horse or its rider. And notice that it was a white horse, the symbol of conquest. And he who sat in it had a bow. He already had a bow when he came out. But it says the crown was given to him. Now this wouldn't be Jesus, because Jesus already had a crown at this time. But when this white horse came forth, and the rider had a bow, the crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. And he's equal in symbolism to the other three horses. So this is not Jesus. Jesus was not equal to anyone. Here we have a Domitian. I believe this is Domitian. Yeah, gold coin of Domitian. Domitian was the emperor who was in power when John wrote the book of Revelation. With the breaking of the first seal and the unrolling of the scroll to the next seal, the vision of future events to that point will be produced by the revealing angel. John sees the visions as if the things he sees are real. Then he will write the sights and sounds he sees and hears in his book. He will see these things that will begin to happen immediately upon the death of the reigning emperor Domitian, who will die in 96 AD. Here we have the Four Horsemen, sometimes called the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Apocalypse just means a revelation. The four horses and horsemen as released under the first four seals. The white, meaning victorious conquest. The red, civil war. The black, famine and depression. And the pale horse, sometimes called the chlorotic or the pale green horse. Disease, war, and death. Revelation 6, 1 and 2. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Now we've read this before, but that was the lesson text for the lesson. That was the text for the lesson. This is a part of the lesson. Here we see one of the emperors with a white horse pulling his chariot in Rome. A white horse. I know that Jesus is pictured in chapter 19 and in Psalm 45 riding on a white horse. This had led some to think the rider on this white horse is Jesus also. But although white robes signify purity of character, a white horse signifies victorious conquest. There's much more to Jesus, the picture of Jesus in Revelation 19 than just the horse. There are many other indicators that it was Jesus. This one, it just represents conquest, victorious conquest. It is well known that the Roman emperor used milk-white horses in the triumphal parade in the city of Rome. See Johnson's commentary on this. The People's Commentary on the New Testament is what's here. And the opening of the first seal would reveal events that would be future from John's time and would represent conditions in the Roman Empire immediately after the death of Domitian. It would be part of the after this that the angel told John to write about. Remember, he said to write the things that are and the things that will take place after this. Well, this is the beginning. This chapter is the beginning of the things that would be after this. Future events. We've seen this before. Here's Domitian. No, this is Trajan. Okay, this is the Emperor Trajan. He reigned from 98. He was the next emperor that came after Domitian, and he reigned from 98 to 117 AD. He was one of the Antonine emperors. Conquest of Trajan. Trajan conquered the nations of the east to the borders of India, including all of Armenia, Assyria, Persia, Mesopotamia, and Arabia. And some think that it was probably the lion, the living creature that had the lion's head, face, because the lion's face is the four cherubim, or living creatures, represent the four parts of the earth, or four sections of the earth. And it's thought that the lion represented the east, the oriental part of the earth. I quote Gibbon. Every day the astonished Senate received intelligence of new names and new nations that acknowledged his sway. The kings of Bosphorus, Colchis, Iberia, Albania, Osirene, and Parthia received their crowns from the hand of Trajan. It was the period of the greatest conquest of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire is greatest extent in 180 AD. Give you a little bit of time to study that. On the right there is some of the conquests of Trajan. Trajan compared himself to Alexander the Great, except he was a much older man. He said he wished that he'd started his conquest younger. He might have gone farther with his conquest. Gibbon continues, the many colonies that were formed became a perfect representation of the great parent, Rome. They gladly accepted and cherished the culture, government, laws, and protection of Rome. They became as much Roman as the cities of Italy. The obedience of the Roman world was uniform, voluntary, and permanent. Of course, we mean permanent in a relative sense terms. Here we see the Roman army on the march. The conquered people, as a rule, joyfully gave up their independence. The Roman army served all equally against the common enemy of the empire. I should say enemies. There were more than one. The local civil magistrates seldom required the use of a military force. There was general peace and security throughout the empire. These are all quotations from Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, quoted throughout the lessons. Here's a picture of Edward Gibbon, the historian. The Antonines. The period of the Antonines, represented by the white horse and its rider, was from Trajan to Commodus, 96 to 180 AD. Here's what Edward Gibbon's classic history of the period has to say. If a man were called to fix the period of the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. This is a white horse. The conquering white horse and rider symbolized the period of the Antonines, 96 to 180 AD. The red horse and horsemen of Civil War. Before we leave the white horse, I want to say that I wrote an essay outlining my reasons for believing that the white horse was this period in Roman history, and I'll post that later on. I think I posted it once before on Facebook. I'll put it there again. Okay, the red horse and horsemen of Civil War, and that period is from 193 to 284. Revelation 6, 3 and 4. When he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat upon it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. This is Civil War. Red horse and rider represent the great civil war in the empire that erupted with the accession of Commodus in 180 AD. These are actual periods, they're historic periods that are easy to describe, and they're very clearly marked, as Gibbon will tell you. Roman Civil War. The second living creature. A theory about the identity of the four living creatures has been mentioned, and that was that each of the creatures represented a quarter section of the earth. The first was said to represent the Asiatic, the second the African, the third the European, and the fourth the New World. However, the order as called forth under the first four seals seems to negate that theory, if the civil wars began in Europe and not in Africa. But Gibbon said that Cleander, whom Commodus had set over the collection and distribution of grain, abused his power and might have brought on the civil war by starving the people because of his greed, selling the grain to the highest bidder. If his behavior was causative, and if northern Africa was indeed the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, then the second living creature, if it did represent Africa, might truly have been the one to call forth the red horse and its rider, because that's what started. The shortage of grain is what started, and the grain was produced mostly in northern Africa, and this is what they think caused or started the Civil War. So what do you think about that? I quote Barnes' notes. Of the applicability of this to the time supposed to be represented by this seal, we have the fullest confirmation in the series of civil wars commencing with the assassination of the Emperor Commodus 193 AD, and continued with scarcely any intervals of intermission for 80 or 90 years. So Sismondi, on the fall of the Roman Empire, says, with Commodus' death commenced the third and most calamitous period. It lasted 92 years, from 192 to 284. So we have another historian with his testimony to this fact. During that time, 32 emperors and 27 pretenders to the empire alternately hurried each other from the throne by incessant civil warfare. 92 years of almost incessant civil warfare taught the world on which a frail foundation the virtue of the Antonines had reared the felicity of the empire. This is an interesting way of talking. From Barnes' notes, which is in the public domain, I add that the reign of Commodus 180 to 193 was a bloody time that initiated the unrest that led to the civil wars. Here we see a depiction of one of the battles of the Civil War. One historian speaking of this period refers to Gibbon's statement about the general happy state of the empire under the Antonines, Then he says, yet in the next century the Roman Empire crumbled. There were civil wars between 180 and 285 AD. Of 27 emperors, or would-be emperors, all but 2 met violent deaths. Meanwhile, the Persians raided to Antioch in the east, and in Europe the barbarians broke through the frontier. Huge tracts of country were devastated. The middle class was squeezed out of existence. Farmers and laborers were transformed into serfs. When in 285 AD Diocletian pulled the empire together again, there was but little left of the prosperity of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Professor Gerhard Rempel, Western New England College. This was his assessment. The Black Horse and Rider, representing famine and pestilence. Revelation 6:5-6. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature saying, Come. I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures saying, A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Now, a denarius was supposedly a day's wages. Clues. The black color, the balanced scale, the order of appearance of the horse and rider, and the words spoken were all clues to the meaning of the ominous symbol. Black is the color of the judicial robes, as the scales in the ancient symbol of justice, since Belshazzar saw the handwriting on the wall in ancient Babylon. But there are also other meanings. Multiple meanings. We're talking about the black now. The black and the scales. Black is also the symbol of mourning and death, and of drought and famine, and the words spoken indicate that the scales may also mean scarcity of grain. The words say a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Those are the words that were spoken by the third living creature. Although the quarts are not weighed in a balance, the idea is scarcity. A denarius was a day's pay for a common labor, and a quart was a daily allotment of this staple for 1 man. The price for barley or wheat, therefore, was 8 times their usual price. According to Mr. Gibbon, the lands were measured by surveyors who were sent into the provinces. Their nature, whether arable or pasture or woods, was distinctly reported, and an estimate made of their common value from the average produce of 5 years. The number of slaves and of cattle constituted an essential part of the report. An oath was administered to the proprietors, which bound them to disclose the true state of their affairs. And their attempts to prevaricate or elude the intention of the legislatures were severely watched and punished as an actual crime, as a capital crime, which included the double guilt of treason and of sacrilege. According to the different nature of lands, their real produce in the various articles of wine, oil, grain, and barley, wood or iron was transported by the labor or at the expense of the provincials to the imperial magazines. In other words, they were highly taxed. from whence they were occasionally distributed for the use of the court or of the army and of the two capitals, Rome and Constantinople. End of quote from Gibbon. Because of the wars, the severity and strict taxation and administration of justice in the event of falsification of financial records, the recent losses of lives and crops to drought and pestilence, and the confiscation of lands from farmers, these extreme conditions existed. Food was in short supply for the common people. The black horse of famine. Now, these things follow logical progression, beginning with the red horse. Civil war would lead to famine, death, pestilence. This horse and its rider bring famine in the wake of a protracted civil war that has devastated the empire. Often famine comes in the wake of war because the normal production of food is interrupted in the war zone. This long civil war in the Roman Empire involved almost every province in the great sprawling civilization. Burning of crops was common. As mentioned before, when Diocletian came to power, the farmers had lost their independence. Taxed out of business, they were reduced to the status of serfs or sharecroppers. In the time of Marcus Aurelius, fully 1/4 of the population of the empire died from plague and starvation. The wealthy, as in our own Great Depression of the 30s, were not seriously affected. That might explain why the voice told the riders not to hurt the oil or wine. These were luxury items and not the annual food crops, many of which had been burned. During this period of severe taxation and scarcity, an order was issued from Rome that amazingly gives the order to not hurt the wine and oil. I quote Mr. Gibbon: "If anyone shall sacrilegiously cut a vine, or stint the fruit of prolific boughs, and craftily feign poverty in order to avoid a fair assessment, he shall immediately, on detection, suffer death, and his property be confiscated." The Antonine Plague. This plague was part of the work of both the black and the pale horses. I quote: "There was the plague of Marcus Aurelius, the old Roman emperor, who dies in Gladiator, the movie, also called the Antonine Plague, which raged from about 165 to 180 Christian era." We would say AD. In 165, the Roman army, while fighting the Parthians, an empire that occupied areas in Iran and environs, contracted something contagious, maybe smallpox, which caused them to give up on the battle and go home. You ever see the east there? In doing so, they spread the plague throughout the empire. The area of the Mediterranean basin, including parts of Asia Minor, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. The leader of the plague-ridden army was Lucius Verus, who was co-conqueror with Marcus Aurelius, co-emperor rather. Statue of Marcus Aurelius in Rome. Conveniently for Marcus Aurelius, Lucius Verus himself succumbed to the plague a few years later, leaving Marcus Aurelius as sole emperor. The plague killed an estimated 25 to 35% of those in the worst affected parts of the empire. Medhunters.com. This information comes from medhunters.com. More information from Gibbon about this period. As Gibbon had said, the Antonine period was the happiest for mankind, So now he says the period that immediately followed were the blackest times in human history. Pestilence and famine continued to fill up the calamities of Rome, he said. He said the real culprit was Cleander, who ran the Roman government for Commodus. A greedy man, he got a monopoly on the grain. An open civil war in Alexandria, that's in Egypt, lasted more than 12 years. Floods, earthquakes, uncommon meteors, unusual darkness, and a crowd of other prodigies occurred during this time. A long and general famine, the result of rapine and oppression, destroyed the produce and promise of future harvests. And that's a quotation from Gibbon. Here's the pale horse. The pale horse, chlorotic horse, representing war, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts. Death, disease, pestilence. The pale horse follows civil war and famine. Revelation 6, 7, and 8. When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come." Now this would be the eagle, I guess, the eagle. I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Remember that in the time of Marcus Aurelius, fully 25% of the empire that was affected by these diseases and pestilence and so forth died. The Four Horsemen. Although one followed the other as natural progression, there was overlap among these horses and their riders. As we said before, war and a monopoly on grain brought famine and pestilence. Then, when the civilized world was devastated or drastically depopulated, the wild, ravenous, predatory beasts of the earth could roam at will, kill, devour, and multiply in great numbers. There is a story of one pack of an estimated 1,500 wolves ravaging the countryside at one point. Death and Hades. Death rode the pale horse, and Hades followed him. Death is the demise of the flesh. Hades is the prison of the spirit. First you die, then your spirit goes somewhere, and that's the prison of the spirit, Hades. Authority was given this rider to kill with the sword. Gibbon refers to the period that we have mentioned before, speaking of the siege and capture of Philippolis. A 100,000 persons are reported to have been massacred in the sack of that great city, he says, that's Philippolis. In another place he writes, the whole period was one interrupted series of confusion and calamity. The Roman Empire was, at the same time, and on every side, attacked by the blind fury of foreign invaders and the wild ambition of domestic usurpers. Very sad time to be alive in Rome, in the Roman Empire. Such were the barbarians, and such the tyrants who, under the reigns of Valerian and Gallienus, dismembered the provinces and reduced the empire to the lowest pitch of disgrace and ruin, from whence it seemed impossible that it should ever emerge. But of course it did later. More from Gibbon. Gibbon tells us that the famine was followed by epidemial disease. A furious plague raged 15 years without interruption in every province, city, and family, of the Roman Empire. 5,000 people died in Rome every day. Many towns were completely depopulated. Here we have some of the wild beasts that might have done the damage. We don't see any wolves there, but wolves might have been there too. Could we extend the analogy to the other provinces? We might suspect that war, pestilence, and famine had consumed in a few years the moiety of the human species. Moiety means the majority. There were panthers, tigers, lions, bears, and wolves roaming the depopulated towns and country. These, when pressed by hunger, infested the open villages and open country. Again, Gibbon speaking. As we will see when the fifth seal is broken, the Christians are being brutally persecuted all during the same period. The Four Horsemen ride roughshod through the vast empire. There are 10 major persecutions between Domitian and Constantine. Christians were blamed for every calamity, as when the Roman soldiers brought the plague back from the east. Only one question for discussion. For this lesson, there is only one question, but it's a big one. This is a question that requires much thought and talk. Here it is. Between the death of Domitian and the victory of Constantine at the Milvian Bridge, 4 horsemen rode. What did they signify? Push the pause button if you need more time. If you're in a group, you can discuss it. If not, just think about it. And if you don't remember, go back and review the lesson. Conclusion. Written on the scroll of the first 4 seals was the story of the Roman Empire from the time of John the Apostle to the time of Constantine and the great political and cultural upheaval that overthrew pagan Rome. In our next episode, we will read about that great symbolic earthquake, probably the greatest revolution the world has ever known, has ever seen. We have so far seen about 200 years of the future from John's time. These approximately 200 years are revealed under the first 4 seals, the first 4 horsemen, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These 4 symbolic horsemen have been called forth by the political and cultural conditions of their time, but we can be sure God had a hand in all of it. The fact that the cherubim who represent God's people throughout the earth have called them forth indicates that these horsemen came to make the changes necessary for the church to survive. We will also get a glimpse of the martyrs, those who had been killed for their faith and for refusing to deny Jesus and the gospel. The group John saw are those who would be slain during the 200 years symbolized by the 4 horsemen. We will see that they were given white robes and told to be patient for a while longer. They were promised that they would reign victoriously over their enemies and in some sense over those who had murdered them. We will discuss this concept in detail when we study chapter 20. That's the chapter of the millennium. John Hus is condemned by the papal court for preaching the Bible. One of the martyrs. These martyrs were told that others must be added to their number before their vindication on earth comes. Many others would be killed for their faith during the 1260 years of the Great Tribulation under the Papal Empire, under Rome and the Papal Empire. This Papal Empire, or the political or temporal reign of the popes of Rome, would kill many more faithful martyrs than the Roman emperors did. The first 4 seals. Rome victorious, civil war, taxation, depression, decay, and death. In this lesson we have seen the opening of the first 4 seals. We will look at this outline several times in the next few lessons. I think it is an accurate portrayal of what the seals represent. Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, a poem by Ellis. 4 horsemen ride so far and wide at the cherubim's command. The white with bow is told to go and conquer all the land. The Antonine, a conquering line, fulfills the symbol well. The red goes next to kill and vex and send men's souls to hell. Worship of Mars, incessant wars within its wide domain, Roman pride and fratricide did leave a bloody stain. The black with scales weighs grain that fails to feed the starving masses. The war's sad loss was sure the cause of famine of the grasses. Death and Hades, plagues, disease, brought awful loss of life, and not the least the ravenous beast with which the land was rife. Much of the earth now suffered dearth and mourned their sad condition. As men grew tired, their gods expired, then a Christian revolution. That'll be in the next lesson. Next, lesson 10 of 26, seals 5 and 6, the martyrs and the great upheaval. Revelation 6, 9 through 17. The end. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.